I always like that introduction. Hi, everybody. Jay Myers here. I'm the CEO of Next Generation Manufacturing Canada. And today I'm joined by a number of leaders from industry sector, from technology, who are focusing on circular manufacturing, circular economy. This is going to be a major theme of NGen going forward, not only in terms of the focus for our next stream of funding, but of course, it's such an important issue today with respect to environmental sustainability and the expectations of customers, of stakeholders, of government regulators, of investors, how we manage materials that we don't want to get into the environment. How do we manage products from not only from the point of view of production, but through their entire life cycle as well? How do we identify, how do we make profit from some of the waste that is being created in industrial processes? And so those are some of the key themes that we want to talk about today. I'm joined by a great panel here, Tony Valeri. Tony is the president and CEO of Ridge Strategies, and I've worked with Tony for a long time in his career with the federal government, but also in the work that he's done around decarbonization, particularly with ArcelorMittal Dofasco. Jun Xu from CNEM, Chris Stern, who's the CEO of Carbocrete, Khalid Bokali, who is the CEO of Labs Cubed, and Lena Bowden, who is the partner and CFO of Carmita DeYoung. So let me start off with a very broad question to each of our panelists, and that is, when we talk about circular manufacturing, what does it mean for you? And Lena, maybe if I could start with you first.
Okay. I always think of circular economy as the cradle to cradle kind of concept. So the inputs that we put in, we're always conscious of the products that we create and where those products end up. So for example, in our situation, we're working on a project called Life Cycle PPE, where we were looking at creating a self-sustaining supply chain. So it goes back several spaces to that. So it's really just that cradle to cradle vision is how I kind of envision it. So always thinking about inputs and outputs and where they land.
Great. Khalid, I know that Labs Cubed is really engaged in developing some of the instrumentation around managing circular manufacturing. What does that mean for you?
Yeah, for us, we look at it, looking at obviously the polymer side, so plastics, rubbers, et cetera. It's all about how do you start reusing that material usefully? So it gets reused into something where, I think for me, circular is taking, for example, a high-end piece of plastic and using it as another high-end piece of plastic versus that high-end piece of plastic becoming a piece of fabric, right? So that to me is more circular. That material, all the engineering, all the time that's gone into it, it's reused back into something that is kind of equivalent to what it kind of started with, which is not easy, but that's the way I see it, and that's the way we see it.
Great, thanks, Clay. Chris, Carbocrete's doing some neat stuff in terms of negative carbon building material.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Pleasure to be here. So for me, the circular manufacturing, at least in our analog, is taking materials that are of little to no value or negative value and putting them all together and coming up with something that's of high value and that you can explain to anybody. In our case, it's concrete, and we're taking steel slag, which ends up in landfill. We're taking CO2, which is coming out of smokestacks or being captured from the air, and we're putting this all together to make a product that you can explain to your grandmother. It's concrete blocks. So that's how I see circular manufacturing.
Thanks, Chris. Jun, I'll pass it over. I know CNEM is also very engaged in this area.
Yeah, thanks, Jason, for having me. Yes, we are doing a green recycling process for battery black mass, which means that from the battery industry, you have the battery manufacturing, then you have the integration of batteries into electrical vehicles, and after 8 to 10 years, you have the the battery reaches the service life, then you have to recycle that. So we are working on recycling process to get the battery materials back by reconditioning and back to the manufacturing circuit to make more batteries like that way. So it's something, it's a closed loop manufacturing like that way.
And an area which is of real strategic significance, because the recovery of the critical material that is required for batteries is an alternative process to some of the environmentally impactful mining operations that people usually think about too.
Yeah, indeed, exactly.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jim. I didn't want to interrupt.
Yeah, I see that because in Ontario we have lots of involvement from the past. We have lots of resources. For example, in the Sudbury areas, there are lots of nickel productions. Now with recycling, there are traditional methods of pyrometallurgical process and hydrometallurgical process. But we feel that there are still some drawbacks over there. We try to improve that with a green recycling process. Thanks.
Great. No, thank you. Tony, from your perspective and the work you've done with ArcelorMittal, how do you see and how would you explain circular manufacturing to the public?
Thanks, Jay. I think building a bit on what Chris was saying, is kind of thinking of waste or byproducts as a resource as opposed to a cost. So you think of the input, what comes out the other end, and how do you utilize it? Thinking about supply chains in a much more holistic manner. So in our case, if you think of steel, people understand scrap. They see scrap yards. They know their vehicles get scrapped. Making the connection for people that scrap is utilized back in the steelmaking process, and that you see a very significant shift in the steel sector today, moving away from coal to more of a scrap-based steelmaking. So, I mean, steel has been recycling and is I think it's the most recycled product today. I think we're going to see more of that. So when you think of circular and you think of the work I've been doing at ArcelorMittal Dofasco, it's really about, what was considered a waste is now really being viewed as a resource as opposed to just a cost.
I think that general theme of waste to profit is really a key idea to get the theme of circular manufacturing, circular economy across. I had an opportunity to visit one of the manufacturing centers in Chicago about 10 years ago, and they had a program that was set up, and they called it waste to profit. The idea was to map out all of the waste that is being generated in a very diverse manufacturing sector across the Chicago area, and then to match it up with companies who could use that waste and generate something that was profitable from it. And it sounded great, but that program died within about 2 years of them setting it up, and it was maybe a little bit ambitious at the time, but it's not. This isn't easy, and it's not necessarily something that a lot of manufacturers think about, but it's not something necessarily that a lot of customers generally think about as well. What do you see as some of the maybe some of the obstacles, some of the hurdles that need to be overcome in a very different type of manufacturing system? And maybe start back with you, Lena.
Yeah, challenges and risks. There's certainly lots of them. So Carmina de Young is a garment manufacturer. So we have always pride ourselves on being a very sustainable company. So right from the get-go, we're looking at circular ways. And when you were all talking about waste on the shop floor, on our cutting floor, when we're making garments, 10 to 15% of the fabric gets wasted. So we're always looking at ways to repurpose that waste and actually minimize that waste. So we're kind of creating new products, like smaller items that we can sort of make, through that cutting to avoid things ending up on then in landfill. So we've been very successful in doing that. On the flip side, we've been also, during the pandemic, we were making PPE, and NGen supported one of our projects, which was a big project and a big vision to create a self-sustaining supply chain for PPE. And, we're still moving forward with that initiative, but it's been really challenging. We had to get 3 different businesses off the ground. So one is a recycling place that takes medical textile and recycles it. And then we had to create a textile facility and then create the textile. And then Carmina de Young was making the medical gowns. So we had to actually have a market for medical gowns to be able to make the whole process work. So number one, that market doesn't exist in Canada anymore. We cannot make PPE in Canada at a price that is competitive with China. So the market's gone back to buying PPE offshore. So number one, it's market. The second thing is we had to get 3 different companies being viable. So to create a circular economy like we wanted to do for PPE, we either had to do a vertical integration within a company so that you have, that idea where you take control of your supply chain. But in our case, we were, working to collaborate with 3 different companies, and, sometimes even getting those companies off the ground was a challenge. So, there has to be a market, there has to be more collaboration, that collaboration has to work. But also, I think there's a lot of challenges in recycling, as we know, in plastics. And so there's hurdles and expertise that's not there in terms of the recycling side of the business. So our recycling business is still challenged to try and make that work. Recycling medical textile sounds easy. It's complicated because there's different variations. And so I think the knowledge base of recycling is kind of needed in our country to be able to actually put some dollars towards that. That's really hard for Canada to do.
That sounds like a really good introduction to you, Khalid, and some of the work that you're doing with plastics. I think maybe of all the sectors, that is one that's particularly under the gun today.
Yeah, for sure. Lena, I agree with everything you said, by the way, like quite wholeheartedly. A lot more money, a lot more expertise needs to go into that side because it's the only way to really solve it. I think the main hurdle that I see especially with plastics when it comes to recycling, is cost, right? In the end, if it's more expensive to use a recycled plastic back into your system than it is to use a virgin plastic, you're going to go for the virgin plastic. That's just how companies operate. In the end, it has to make dollar sense as well as be green at the same time. But your competitors, some of them aren't going to care too much, and they might go and buy the virgin and make their product cheaper. And then that's just how it works when it comes to mass production of bottles, et cetera. It's that the margins are so low. So I think it's trying to figure out better ways of trying to get that cost under. So I think the only way to do that is real innovation. So, in our case, we're looking at different ways of doing it. We see a lot of great companies around doing new and innovative things in terms of mechanical recycling, chemical recycling, trying to come up with new ways of recycling plastics so they can be recycled and reused very quickly into amazing new products at a lower cost. But I think a lot of money in R&D and expertise needs to be built up to be able to do that. It's not simply grinding down plastics and throwing them back in. That doesn't work. We've tried that. It hasn't produced as much as we would have liked. So I think that's kind of where I see it. It's how do you get the cost to be lower? And that's when you'll get industry to really jump into it. Or government obviously comes in and says, hey, you have to use this percentage of recycling. Like in Europe, I think they have a lot more regulations around this. That's another trigger point. That's another way to push people and companies to do it. But those are the only 2 ways, right? It has to be cheaper, and it meets that quality standard that is required, or it has to be kind of government forced through. Otherwise, in the end, it's dollars and cents for businesses.
Khalid, what you're doing, though, is also tackling one of the big technical issues or innovation challenges, particularly with plastics, in really trying to understand the characteristics of that soup that's being developed as a result of trying to recycle various plastics and reuse various plastics together.
Yeah, so our goal is to use kind of automation and fully automated labs to essentially build a system that is indifferent towards the materials that are coming into a recycled material facility every day. So every day, a plastic recycling facility will take in, imagine your recycling bin is just full of different kinds of plastics that are dirty, contaminated, et cetera, et cetera. So how the heck do you produce something high end out of that without it costing a ton of money to sort out, to clean through, to pick out the right things? And so we believe kind of the way to do that is to use automation, a fully automated lab and AI systems effectively to do that. But obviously that takes a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of upfront resources that are required. And so it's one of those catches where how do you convince someone that that's the right way to do it before actually having the system up and running? And so I think what Lena was saying was quite accurate. You have to build multiple companies effectively. You have to go through all these very complicated, and it just requires so much resources. This is physical resources, and there's no other way around it. So we're getting through it. We started very different. We kind of tackled it by building testing equipment for these material producers that they can put into their labs today. So kind of on a smaller scale, so that we can generate enough revenue to build the big thing, because nobody would give me enough money to do the big thing, the big audacious goal. It just wasn't there. So that's kind of the way we've tackled it a little bit. Yeah. Great.
Thanks. So Chris, tell us a little bit about Carbocrete and what you're aiming to do, and maybe some of the issues that you're confronting.
Yeah, so I mean, we're aiming to disrupt the masonry world to get our products to replace regular cement-based concrete. So it's my second startup, and when I got into this, my last startup was in solar power, and the concept was, how do you make solar power so that everybody could accept it on their roof? And that means it needs to be the same price or less price, or there's some benefit, because people don't care that much. They want to have a bigger recycling box, but they don't want to have to pay for it. So it's like that's the only analogy I can come up with. But the concept is, come up with a business model such that it's inevitable that they would select your technology to be the technology of choice. And it just so happens ours is a carbon negative technology. So we have to create the situation where that's true. And when we got into this, it was going to be a licensing deal. We just sell licenses and be done with it. Well, as you dig in, you realize that we have to help people convert their factories, and then you have to help people get their supply chain up and running. So it's about making everything friction free, so that the obvious choice is to go with your technology. And so that's been what we've been working on since 2016, effectively. Make ours the obvious choice. If you're within 200 kilometers of a steel plant, there's no reason why you wouldn't make masonry with Carbocrete. It's the be all and end all technology that makes sense when you're not far from a steel plant.
Right. Thanks, Chris. And Jordan, if you don't mind, maybe I'll flick over to Tony here and ask what from the perspective of a steel producer, what are some of the issues that a company like ArcelorMittal Dofasco is facing, and what sort of the opportunity that you see with a company like Carbocrete, for instance, Tony?
Right. Thanks, Jay. So if I sort of harken back to what Lena was saying about a market and having to develop a market for product, in our case, the market exists, and our barriers or risks are really things like impacts to quality or productivity. So if you think of scrap as opposed to virgin iron ore, potentially impacts the quality of liquid steel. So if you think of the steel, the outer skin of vehicles, really needs to be void of impurities. And so that's a challenge as we make this transition for that type of product. I think of our increased use of biocarbon versus coal, moving away from coal and using biocarbon in the furnace. Well, the ash content or the less carbonization perhaps in the biocarbon will affect the efficiency of the furnace. So for us, looking at that circularity and looking at other products as opposed to extracted products does introduce a challenge of perhaps some quality and some productivity issues. Another big one is the underdeveloped supply chains. If I just think again of biocarbon, like 100,000 tons of biomaterial forest waste makes about 25,000 tons of biocarbon. Far less than what we would need in our facility to utilize that product. So the lack of development of that supply chain is also a barrier, I think, to increasing circularity with respect to the steel sector. One that no one's mentioned yet, and one that I've often run across, some of the technology, I think of energy from waste or waste to gas. And that process, and sometimes the reaction people have to that technology, sort of, not in my backyard. It's okay, we get the concept, but we don't want a facility anywhere near our community that would provide that kind of syngas or that other opportunity to stay away from fossil or extracted type of material. So those are some of the challenges, I think. But then again, to Chris's point, and his product, I think the use of slag, and for us perhaps the improvement of steel slag for further use is also, I think, an opportunity for for Carbon Creed and other organizations to be able to use that kind of product to displace cement in that product.
The good news is that Dofasco is converting to EAF, which is going to give us more slag. So we're happy about that.
You're happy about that.
Jim, back to you and
Yes.
Simon. So
Yeah.
you have an alternative way of extracting these critical minerals from batteries, which is a very different process, of course, than what is grabbing the headlines in terms of how Canada is going to mine all of these resources and get them out of the ground. What are some of the challenges that you're facing?
Actually, you know what? In our practice, we have something related to their presentations. I'm glad to learn those recycling of polymers, and also for the steel slags, you recycle that to construction materials. Those are great ideas. So some of them are actually really related to our battery recycling. Our company, CNAM, that stands for Canadian New Energy Materials Corporation. Basically, we are working in the field of energy materials. In the past, we were working with metal foams, ultrafine metal powders for batteries, for fuel cells, supercapacitors, or whatever, and for additive manufacturing as well. Now, with the booming of the EV industry, and because we have been monitoring that industry a lot, so we feel that there is a need to solve that recycling effectiveness as well. So that's why we are working on the battery recycling side. So traditionally, people use pyrometallurgy and hydrometallurgy to do the recovery. So basically, pyrometallurgy, as the name says, it's with the fire, which is a furnace operating at the 1600 degrees Celsius. You melt everything down of the batteries and try to recover a little bit. Then there will be lots of slags for Chris to practice to make your construction materials. And from the battery side, there are polymer separator and the covers from the battery side. You can use this stuff for recycling with polymers. And if that goes to a furnace, that will burn that to carbon dioxide, which is bad. There are another traditional way, which is hydrometallurgy, which use a strong acid such as sulfuric acid, nitric acid, or hydrochloric acid to dissolve everything. Again, you add lots of stuff to that materials processing. At the end, the acid functional groups is not a part of the battery materials. You have to get rid of that. Then again, you may have waste somewhere in the gas atmosphere, or in liquid stream, which is wastewater, or in waste sludge. So now we think about that. When you use battery, you use that. You don't use any materials out of it. You just use the electricity transferred from storage to usage. Then the materials are all over there, except that at the end of the battery, there is some structures changes inside. Basically, there's separations of the active materials from the current collector, which is the electrode itself. So if we recycle those materials, if we can get to the battery materials and by reconditioning to restore their performance, and then reuse that for battery manufacturing, so that will be with great energy savings, and you minimize the waste materials and reduce CO2 or whatever. And that's our concept. We try to use that for the green recycling. So that's our activities. And at the same time, we hope to learn more from our colleagues here with the battery, with the polymer processing, with the slag processing.
Oh, that's great. All of you have spoken about the supply chain and how important that overall supply chain is, but you've also talked about, more than a supply chain. It's a system. It's the recycling is important. That what the regulators are doing is important. How manufacturers see this new process is important. And maybe a general question rather than pointing it out. How this is the concept of circular manufacturing and life cycle product management and waste to profit is really opening up some new business opportunities and demanding a different supply chain or value chain around manufacturing. What do you see in terms of some of the opportunities for Canada going forward in this area generally, and I know each of you are contributing to some of those opportunities yourself. But is this really a great business opportunity for the future, or is it something that is going to be a great idea but is going to be really difficult to get off the ground? I'll open that question up and then I'll start pointing too. But whoever would like to take that on first. Hey, Chris.
You're muted, Chris.
Yeah, it's so 2020. Look, I think it'd be interesting in the context of Canada, to bring out some carrots, and say, if you use carbon neutral or carbon negative concrete, you get a 5% sort of adder, to the contractor that's using it, like in infrastructure projects. I think carrots work well, and we've talked about carbon tax and other things, but at the end, somebody that's actually doing the project has to get paid. And I think it's worked well in the past in the U.S. After the ARRA of 2009 or 2010, whatever it was. It really incentivized people in the States. And I think we need to do similar things here in order to get people to use circular products or low carbon products or carbon negative products or things like that.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah, I don't know. Me to go next.
Go ahead.
I guess two things. One, I believe that the concept of reshoring manufacturing, so the idea that we can make things here in Canada, is very much related to the circular economy question, because I think to do circular economies well, we have to be able to make things here. And you can't just keep bringing things in from China and then pushing them to the landfill. Like, you have to be able to create that circular economy. And I think what our grant with NGen actually gave us that opportunity to start with a blank sheet of paper and say, if you're going to start a business in Canada today, this is a huge opportunity to start a business that actually tackles one of our biggest challenges. So if you're going to start from scratch, how would you create a business? And in our case, we created 3 that created this self-sustaining supply chain. And again, granted, we're still working hard at that and making that come to fruition, but we've planted some seeds, and I think that's sort of the benefit. So I think the two things are linked, being able to make things here in Canada and also to think about business as, you create a business to solve a problem, not to make money.
No,
Maybe I'll jump in there, Jay.
Sorry, Tony. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I think, from a Canadian perspective, I find the conversation so far around circularity is kind of almost framed like it's nice to have. And I think we kind of shift it to, this is the way forward. We must do circularity, right? And so what that brings, I think, are a bunch of regulatory, requirements that position the manufacturing sector to respond. And I think, for the longest time in Canada, there was a view that you needed to put a price on carbon in order to get a reaction and in order to incentivize large and small companies to start to react to reduce their carbon. But the IRA has actually demonstrated that significant incentive, that actually pays to support the production of lower intensity product, is actually creating some significant beneficial outcomes for the United States in terms of their path to net zero. And so I would say, along with that, promoting the right mindset, putting in place the right regulation, creating the kind of significant investment, and then dragging sort of the consumer responsibility, because ultimately the consumer is the one that's going to create a bit of the market or the market for these products. If you bring that consumer responsibility to create that market demand, then you start to have the right elements that can actually get circularity, not as a nice thing to have, but actually the way our economy works. And that's domestically. And then if you take it one level higher and you start to really understand, I think I read today that the EU and the US are talking about coming to an agreement on the standardization of carbon intensity in products. That's ultimately going to lead to trade policy and will become, if you're exporting and you're importing, whatever you're doing, the carbon intensity of your product will ultimately matter when this is all said and done, if we stay on the track that we're on.
Thanks, Tony, and as you and Chris were both pointing out, that taking carbon and not only developing negative carbon processes, but embedding the carbon into regenerative material is going to be a very important part of how we respond to some of the challenges of climate change. Jun, you.
Yes, I totally agree with Tony and Chris regarding that the carbon intensity. Our Canadian Prime Minister has already promised that we'll have a carbon neutral electrical vehicle industry by the year 2035. That means we'll have all those 100% vehicles sold at that time with EVs with batteries inside. One side, we see that's a great opportunity. Nowadays we see more and more electrical vehicles on the road. That's great. But in another 12 years, we have 100% of that vehicles on the road. That's a big challenge for us, for Canadians. This is for the Canadian perspective. And for the one side, we have lots of resources, which is good. Especially when people talk about battery metal. That means the nickel. And in Ontario, we are one of the richest places in the world for nickel production, especially in the Sudbury area. And at the same time, now with lots of investment of battery into the EV industry, now I think it's almost around the 200 billion to 300 billion investment levels like that. So in another 5 years or so, you will have lots of batteries retiring from the electrical vehicles. Then we have to recycle those materials correctly. So there's an urgent need, and the government is really pushing for those activities. For example, in Ontario, we have a governing body, which is REPRA, which is resources and REPRA. They are controlling those recycling. That means we have to effectively recycle those materials. If the recycling efficiency is below some levels, they don't allow you to operate. So these are the challenges for us. So that means, from a Canadian perspective side, we have lots of challenges in the coming years to deal with battery recycling. We have to work hard.
Thanks. From your perspective, particularly with respect to polymers and plastics, what do you see the opportunities moving forward?
Yeah, I think anytime there's major change that happens, there's opportunity, right? Like that's the best time to kind of make big businesses make new things. That's where new technology usually creeps up, and there's a shuffle where the major players kind of change around. So you look at the EV market, I guess, being brought up here. Obviously, Tesla would never be built as a normal car company with a normal, engine in it, because that existed. Others have tried, it never passed. They had to come with a new technology. They came with electric vehicles, and so yes, there's a huge opportunity now, especially as markets change. But markets themselves only change for, I think, very few reasons. And I think one of them is government incentives or government pushes. There's something that's above it all where whether it's a negative incentive or a positive incentive, I don't know which one works better. But when that incentive is put in place for people to change the habit, then there's an opportunity there. So with plastics, for example, now, when you look at the EU, there's a huge push here in terms of more recycled content, people thinking about circularity, people thinking about sustainable plastics, biodegradable plastics, et cetera, et cetera. And that creates a whole new paradigm shift in the industry, and everyone falls in that direction. And I think that's where, you know, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, that's something you can take advantage of and build businesses around. And looking one level above that, I think Tony kind of brought it up, where governments are now working on a larger global scale, trying to think about it, because that's also the only way it works. We live in a global economy. And so it doesn't really work that Canada says we're going to be the greenest country in the world and every country around us isn't. I mean, it doesn't mean anything, right? If the US says we don't really care about your blah, 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 your new regulation, our businesses still have to follow theirs, right? 80% goes out of Canada into the US, so it doesn't really matter. So I think when you look at it more from a global perspective, but anytime we see a shift, and right now we're seeing it in the plastics industry, and they're only moving because they're being forced to, otherwise they would stay still. Plastics would never change. Plastic manufacturers make a lot of money and they don't want to change. And so when you see this change, yeah, there's an opportunity. I don't know how good Canada is at jumping at opportunities yet. We'll see how this one goes. The EV market, we're doing pretty well. I guess there's a whole bunch of new battery plants being built, which is awesome to see. It's always fantastic to see that we're kind of there or pushing in that direction. But yeah, I think anytime change happens, there's opportunity.
Which I think too, and particularly, I mean, this was an issue, and Lena had mentioned it with respect to PPE, is if we're setting a goal, a big challenge, or to address a big challenge, then we need to maintain that focus here and to continue to support it. And I think that was one of the key things that we learned with respect to PPE. As soon as the urgency passed, then the support to actually develop a sustainable PPE sector in Canada passed at the same time, and the market, the procurement just wasn't there and couldn't support it. And I think, you know, if we are going to move into a world that is focused more on environmental sustainability, there's a great deal of alignment and goal setting and alignment around targets that have to be sustained for more than 1 year or 2 years. This really has to be a long-term initiative, a long-term investment as well.
But I would say, Jason, just to kind of add to that point, I don't think that's a Canadian issue. I mean, in the US, so I was recently at a healthcare elastomer conference, very fun stuff. And so there was a lot of people presenting about their initiatives that they had with regards to PPE and nitrile gloves and all that kind of stuff. And they were talking about there was a ton of money in the US to bring all of that in and reshore it, obviously. And all of that is disappearing the other way again, right? And it's all down to cost, right? The cost of manufacturing, the cost of that. Like when someone buys a glove or a mask, I don't think most look at where it comes from. You just look for the cheapest option in most cases, unless you're a surgeon, hopefully not, but the average person. And so that process, I think, is not a Canadian issue. I think it's more of a global issue.
Yeah.
And so how do you solve that? I have no idea. I mean,
no, I think
Jason hit it right on the head. You know, the incentives have to get people to the position where it becomes economical or it's inevitable. You know, and the pandemic was the trailer of the movie called Climate Change. You know, and it really got people to move fast, and we all did that together. We came up with, you know, several different vaccines, a way to make PPE, and all the stuff that happened overnight, it seemed, right? And I think we can do the same thing with climate change, as long as there's the right policies in place that will, you know, have the right amount of carrots and sticks that get us to that point. But then at the end, that has to be inevitable. It has to be done this way, you know. So that's my 2 cents.
I think the other thing that we found is that it's a complicated system, and that just suggesting something or providing an incentive in one particular area really isn't isn't adequate if you need to take into consideration the entire supply chain, for example, or the fact that there are lots of technologies there, but how do you prove that they actually work? Can you scale them up to show that they're actually workable in a full-scale industrial production environment here? And what is necessary in order to do that? We're focusing on a lot of support for R&D and tech development, but it's really the adoption of that and incentives around that. How do we encourage customers to adopt, but at the same time make sure that we can demonstrate that these technologies actually work in a full-scale environment? And that's where NGen has been focused in trying to support the scale up and the proof that technologies like yours actually do work, and we can demonstrate that they are very effective for industry there. The first question anybody's going to say is, or first thing they'll say is, show me.
Jay, maybe just, in reaction to the sustainability of the focus on, we didn't have it on PPE, but it's there in climate change because it's more of a global push. And I think of the automotive sector as, kind of the sector that this is really sticking. So, you've got the big sort of government target of 2035. EVs, the majority of fleets need to be EVs. So that drove a whole bunch of R&D, battery production. You got these investments now in batteries and the rest of it. But on the automotive side, and I think of the supply chain, I think of the climate change agenda, the regulatory agenda, the price on carbon, the adoption in the automotive sector of lower carbon intensive product, because consumers are now turning their attention to EVs and lower carbon intensive autos, and the impact on supply chain. So for us as a steel sector, the shift to a lower carbon intensity material is the demand coming from the OEM manufacturers, who are ultimately measuring, or will be measured, by carbon intensity of their end product. So I think of the auto sector and all the elements in the auto parts sector and how large it is, and how the focus is now really targeting low carbon intensity product that ultimately finds its way into the end product, that then gets measured as an embedded carbon intensity in this consumer product, that the consumer is at the floor, on the floor or online ordering their car, and they're looking for that. All along the way, you've got a bunch of incentives, both positive and negative incentives, to support that effort. So if I think of climate change and circularity, I often think of the auto sector as perhaps an example. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's certainly a sector that has driven a lot of that change in response to the climate agenda, and is very visible in supply chains.
Right. Tony, that's a great introduction to a question that we have from one of our viewers, and that is, given the turnover of internal combustion engine vehicles that are coming off the road, why are car companies still buying new steel and aluminum rather than recycling the steel and aluminum that's part of the cars coming off the road?
Well, that's part of the shift in the steel sector, right? When you think of, we're making steel today from virgin iron, so extracted coal, carbon, creating coke, making, the traditional way of making steel, moving to a scrap based, which is using a lot more of the recycled. I think just a big audacious idea. I think of blockchain, and ultimately, could you trace every vehicle that we put our steel in and find a path back to actually use that steel in the next iteration of the material going back to the OEM? That's the transition in the supply chain. So yes, there is a period of transition. I think we'll get to a point where green steel or low carbon intensive steel won't be a premium. it's table stakes. It's kind of the price of admission. If you want to be part of this supply chain, you will have low carbon intensity steel available for automotive OEMs, or they won't buy.
Yeah, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, I think. I mean, like, look, DeFasco and Algoma are switching over to EAF plants, and they're going to be recycling steel. Gerdau is already doing that in Whitby. Mittal is doing that in Quebec. So, I mean, the Canadian steel industry is already doing mostly recycled steel. The only one that's going to be left standing is going to be Stelco at the end, and they're going to have carbon capture. So, I think it's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy when it comes to steel.
All right, thanks, Chris. We've got lots of viewers who are commenting on the discussion here, and thanks everybody who have sent in some comments. Let me wrap up the discussion. I really have enjoyed your perspectives, and when we're talking about circular manufacturing, it is so different from the business models, the supply chains, the thinking about product development and end use than everybody has been used to, and particularly those in the industry. There are a lot of factors around that. Where's the market? How much does it cost, and so forth. But why don't I ask you a very general question here? If 5 years from now, what's the state of circular manufacturing, circular economy going to look like in Canada? Are we going to make some major advances? Do you think, in particularly the sectors that you've been focusing on, or are we still going to be talking about this as a major opportunity that it someday we'll be able to realize some advantages from? Lena, let me start with you, and then I'll
yeah. Well, I kind of come from that apparel and textile sector, so I do believe that there's quite a shift, and maybe through the pandemic, that the consumer is more aware of the materials that make their clothes and where their clothes were made, and microplastics in the oceans as a result of polyester being kind of the prime textile that's being used. So I do feel like consumers are more aware. We are. I was talking about our textile facility in Newmarket, which is Canadian Spun Bond, where we make that spun bond that'll be kind of the outer layer of the mask, but has lots and lots of industrial uses. And I think we're looking at opportunities such as biodegradable raw material. So as time goes on, the fact that we have this facility in Canada to make this textile is going to allow us to do that. So I think our sector is going to be moving towards that, because I think the consumer is demanding it. And I think again, I feel strongly that it's related to the ability for us to make things here in Canada, and to be able to, that's the only way we're going to be able to add this climate action to that aspect of it.
And probably the textile sector is one of the sectors that is using track and trace technologies. Maybe
sure, those are a lot of we were looking at that with their own garments too, to be able to add a traceability to the garments that we put out there in the world, and have exactly that. Where did the material come from? Who made it? Where was it made? When was it made? And we are trying to make long-lasting clothing at the same time.
Thanks, Lena. Go ahead, Del.
Would you like my optimistic or pessimistic response?
Give us both. Good and the bad.
One or the other. In terms of, there's a lot of momentum in the direction of obviously becoming a lot more green and sustainable on the plastic side everywhere globally. I think that conversation is kind of done and dusted in terms of like the fact that we know that we have to change things or fix things. That is, yes, I agree 100%. I think we all agree on that. In terms of if it's going to happen and what's going to happen over the next 5 years, I'm a bit pessimistic about it, because I think there's it's always based on what's happening externally as well, right? Large companies, when they're making money and things are going great, they put these initiatives forward and they still push these big projects. And when things aren't going great, those things kind of usually seem to pause or fail. I only say this because I was looking at the history of sustainability in plastics. And around 10 years ago, there was a huge push for plastic to become more sustainable, approximately 10, 12 years ago. And that seemed to just drop off completely. So we looked at like old trade shows and conferences and what people were presenting in terms of what was hot and the hottest topic. And that decade ago, it was all sustainability. Everyone was talking about bringing these initiatives. Then it died off. And then recently, only in the last year or two, has it started to really pick back up in terms of what we see people talking about. So I feel like it seems to ebb and flow. I don't know why. I don't know why that kind of process keeps happening. I'll be optimistic a little bit, and I'll say now I think there's too much weight moving in the right direction, hopefully, to make this happen. So I think we will be making huge strides and changes in the system. But governments can't let their foot off the gas in terms of, keep putting new incentives to keep people marching in the right direction. Otherwise, they fall off quite easily. So I think it's precarious, but at least moving in the right direction.
Thanks, Gillian. A little bit more optimistic than.
Yeah. I left you guys with some of that.
That's good. Thanks a lot, Chris.
Yeah, I'm an optimistic guy. So, just look at what Energy Star did for appliances. That's kind of what I'd like to see happen to building products and everything else that we buy, because I think educated people that make educated decisions will always choose the thing that makes most sense. And if it's got some great rating, I think the biggest buying group, which is millennials, coming up behind us. I'm not a millennial. Are going to basically make those choices, And I think Energy Star really transformed a lot of things. I think we need the same thing for carbon footprints.
Great. Thanks, Chris. And of course, the whole building sector is going to be so important, not only in terms of the materials used, but also the what that sector is doing to address carbon emissions as well. Yeah.
Yep.
Jun.
Yeah.
Yes. For me, for the battery recycling, I'm very optimistic about that in 5 years. For the EV industry, I would imagine that 100% of the EV battery after the service life that should be recycled. So the question is, how can we get an effective recycling? So I can imagine that there will be still practice of pyrometallurgical recycling, hydrometallurgical recycling, together with a new trend of green recycling. So in that case, this is a competition among those technologies. And for the household battery cells, I hope at that time people will recognize that the recycling as well. Hopefully that will have a high percentage of recycle as well. So in our case, we have already demonstrated the mini plant proof of concept. It works. So now the next step is that we try to organize pilot plant operations as soon as possible in Ontario and Quebec. And later we'll try to, with this pilot plant activities, and we try to commercialize that with local plant setups for the first stage process to collect the materials, and with centralized processing facilities to recondition the materials for reuse, and with good quality control as practice. So this is a practice in our mind.
So I want to ask you, who do you think will have the prime responsibility for making sure that batteries are recycled? The battery manufacturers or the car companies themselves?
Both of that, I think. First of all, for those electrical vehicles, those car makers, they need to make sure their products are fully recycled, and they are developing technology to recycle that as well. So that's a critical part. So and also for the government bodies such as the REPRA in Ontario, they are eyeing those activities, try to get those materials recycled in a proper way. So for battery OEMs, because then after this has shipped the materials to the customers, to their electrical vehicles, actually lost control for that. So I think the car makers will be more responsible for that recycling.
Super, thank you. Tony.
5 years from now, Jay, I think we're still in transition. If you think of 2028 with respect to circularity, I also think I think there was a comment I think Khalid made that in large part our continued focus and activity will be driven by external factors. We're part of North America. I think of border adjustments with the United States and carbon intensity of products, as driving activity in Canada. We depend on export markets. We're also a rules-based country. Our domestic economy is too small to support a large, robust manufacturing sector. So I think on this path in transition, I do see us ultimately getting there because the rest of the world will get there. In particular, North America will get there. What Canada needs to do is to make sure that we're at the table when rules on circularity are being developed so that our manufacturers are not disadvantaged in any way.
Great. Super. Well, let me leave it at that. Some key messages have come out about leadership, and not just industry leadership, but making sure that that governments are leading and working together and aligned. How complex this issue is, that it's not a one-off company issue. It's a collaborative systems approach that needs to be taken. But it's certainly a global initiative that I've heard from all of you. This isn't something that Canada does on its own, and the transformational part of this as well. That it demands a new way of doing business, new thinking about value chains. What we've all seen to be waste? How do you make that into something that is valuable and profitable at the end of the day? So lots of change and different thinking here in terms of the economic model that needs to be implemented. And as I was saying before, show me this work. Show me that that at the end of the day, this is we've got a solution here that can actually be implemented and is better than less costly at the end of the day than what we have right now. So thank you all very, very much. Really appreciate you taking the time, and also to all of our viewers today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.